This embryonic Eurasian world was dominated by an elite known as the Upper Ten and driven by caste differences. Status reflected skin tone.
Well, mostly the upper 10 would be those that would be more looking like a European than the dark-skinned one that was from Malacca, and most probably those are the ones that were more well off than the others. You see, so that was why some of them would be in certain go to certain places where the others couldn't go. So there was segregation. Oh, he's an upper 10, he can go there. We are not upper 10, we can't go in there. So something like that. You see?
This complex caste system was a reflection of the desire of every Eurasian to seem as British as possible. They wanted to belong to the colonial ruling class. The most important expression of this was the Eurasian passion for sports, and in particular, the classic games of the English public school. In the colonial world, sport would be the great leveler.
The reality for the British that was here was that you were not a gentleman unless you were a good sportsman. It was on the sports field that everything was even, that the sports or playing field was the site of pure competition. So if you were the fastest runner or hurdler or best cricketer or best football player, soccer player, then it would be brought to bear on the site of competition.
For the aspiring Eurasian sportsman, the game to master was, of course, cricket. And for many decades, Eurasians played happily alongside the British. It wasn't only on the playing fields of Singapore that the Eurasians wanted to do their bit for Queen and country. In 1854, a Singapore volunteer force was mustered to suppress the growing notoriety of the Chinese secret societies. The Eurasians joined up in large numbers. At first, Eurasian men served as equals with British volunteers, but colonial attitudes soon began to harden.
Very simply, the British didn't want the local-born Singapore Eurasians to be part of their British regiments. So our men got together, and they were all very good marksmen. They decided that they wanted to be in a unit of their own, and that was a way of stamping our identity.
In the mid-19th century, British power reached its zenith in Asia. As new waves of migration transformed the human landscape of the overseas territories, it became imperative for the ruling colonial class to assert superiority over the Asian peoples it ruled, and not only over Asians, but Eurasians as well.
In the British Empire, the color bar was the highest and the most ugly. The Eurasians got caught up in this great spillover effect because of the mutiny of the East India Company Army in 1857. That forced the British to fight such a bloody war and shook them so badly, made them realize how shaky and tenuous their position in Asia really was, how small their numbers really were, that it accelerated a trend which had already been developing, a trend away from willingness to accept local customs and practices and mingle relatively easily in local cultural milieus, towards instead a distancing, a wedging apart, if you will, an emphasizing of European separateness and eventually social and cultural superiority.
This separation fundamentally changed the status of the Eurasian community. They were no longer considered Europeans, and British census reports began to use the term Eurasian for the first time.
The Eurasians. They, of course, were the people who stood the most to lose in any changing of the cultural relationships between white British people in British colonial territories and local Asian people, as they found themselves suddenly exposed, trying to straddle a gap that was becoming wider and wider.
Suddenly, Eurasians with their diverse ancestral roots became an embarrassment, especially if they were darker skinned. Although Eurasians still felt British or European, stoutly loyal to the empire, the British cast them aside. Now, Eurasians in the Singapore Volunteer Force were treated as second-class soldiers, and most would eventually resign from the force. These new attitudes had an impact on the playing fields of Singapore. When the Singapore Cricket Club was established in 1852, Eurasians were denied membership. They were now marginalized by the colonial masters they had faithfully served.